just so I don't forget to do it later. Okay, do you have any questions of me?
I don't think so. I think we're going, it's an hour, right?
Yeah, so we do ask, ideally it's about 45 with 15-minute Q&A. We can do questions at the end, or if you want them interspersed, that's kind of up to you.
I think questions at the end are fine, and I should not go 45. I think like 35, 40 tops. So
Great, sounds
yeah.
good.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, unless you have anything else, I'll go ahead and start letting folks in the room.
That's totally fine. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We'll be getting started shortly. Give folks a couple more minutes. I think we'll get started in we'll give about 2-3 more minutes for folks to roll on in, and then we'll get started. So thank you all for your patience. All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started? So first of all, thank you all for coming. Once again, we're really looking forward to our seminar today. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Eric Gordon here to speak with us. So Eric Gordon is a professor at Emerson College, as well as director of the Engagement Lab and assistant dean of civic partnerships in the School of the Arts. He is also a research affiliate in comparative media studies at MIT. His current research focuses on emergent values-based governance structures in the smart city and the ethics of data access and sharing. Additionally, for the last 10 years, Professor Gordon has explored how game systems and playful processes can augment traditional modes of civic participation. He has served as an expert advisor for local and national governments, as well as NGOs around the world, designing response processes that help organizations transform to meet their stated values. He has created over a dozen games for public sector use and advised organizations on how to build their own inclusive and meaningful processes. He's the author of 2 books in media about media in cities, The Urban Spectator, published in 2010, and Net Locality, published in 2011, and is also the editor of Civic Media, Technology, Design, Practice, and Ludics, Play as Humanistic Inquiry. His most recent monograph, Meaningful Inefficiencies, Civic Design in an Age of Digital Expediency, examines practices in government, journalism, and NGOs that reimagine civic innovation beyond efficiency. So today he'll be speaking on his talk, Beyond Sensing and Engagement, what would it mean for smart cities to actually listen to people? And with that, we will hand it to you, Dr. Gordon. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to get my presentation together. Just give me 1 second. All right, can you all see that? Okay, great. All right, well, it's really, really wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm looking forward to the conversation today. I'm going to give a talk about 35 minutes or so, and then and again, I really encourage the questions and answers. It's my favorite part of doing these things. So today I'm talking on Beyond Sensing and Engagement. What would it mean for smart cities to actually listen to people? And just a little bit more about myself. I'm a scholar, I'm a designer, and I'm a practitioner, sometimes in that order. I study civic media, and specifically the communication structures that facilitate collaboration between institutions and communities. My work has investigated the role of co-design, play, and playful technologies and narrative interventions in values-based urban innovation. So I'm excited to talk to you today about what it means for smart cities to actually listen to people. So let me start with some context. Smart cities, and this is, I'm sure, not new for most people here. Smart cities is a designation that has become a marketing catchphrase that positions competing municipalities in the global marketplace of innovation and creative economies. The label tends to invoke images of responsive technologies and efficient infrastructure. And there are global smart cities competitions, and mayors around the world are eager to put this label on their place. But the standard definition of the smart city does not typically include communication infrastructure. In other words, how institutions communicate with communities. So Meyer and Bolivar argue that the smartness of a city refers to its ability to attract human capital and to mobilize this human capital in collaboration between the various organized and individual actors through the use of information and communication technologies. They identify 4 typical conceptualizations of smart city governance: government of a smart city, smart decision-making, smart administration, and smart urban collaboration. So smart urban collaboration refers to the notion that what makes a city smart is the ability for local governments to partner with other sectors, especially community groups, both formal nonprofits and informal mutual aid, to achieve mutually beneficial ends. But as they point out, this is easier said than done, as truly collaborative governance requires sustained negotiation between a range of stakeholder groups. Smart governance is often defined by its logistic superiority, which can strategically integrate digital media to make smart decisions based on the collection, analysis, and sharing of data. But more technically complex use of data does not always imply better structures of decision-making. So for example, if we imagine dumb governance to look something like this, and smart governance to look like this, we're missing the point. Simply taking more in does not necessarily lead to smart decisions, or more urgently, mutual trust in the intentions of those decisions. And simply being creative in the way information is taken in does not address the problem. So more creative methods of engagement, more dynamic interactions, a greater capacity to collect data still largely leads to decisions being made in the same way. And here, this is a bit of self-critique. This is a platform that I made with my team back in 2011. It was really great at creating a playful context to collect lots of data that surprised the people who were facilitating these processes. But at the end of the day, the data was treated just like all other data that's collected in these processes, which was not really given much weight. So the challenge is that institutions lack the capacity to listen, regardless of how much they ask us to speak. So we need to expand our definition of the smart city to include smart urban collaboration. We need to confront what responsive government looks like and what kinds of arrangements are necessary for the equitable distribution of decisions about public goods and services. And while there is dramatic changes in leadership, take recent mayoral elections in New York and Boston, there is a yawning gap between lip service and practice. Institutions mostly lack the tools, training, and experience to listen to people in ways that their voices impact how decisions get made, implemented, and assessed. Barriers of low trust and disrespect between community and governing institutions and misalignment of priorities leads to antagonism and competition as opposed to the collaboration necessary to meet diverse and critical needs. So instead of quantity of data, we need to look closely at process. We need to strive for procedural justice, which implies recognizing and respecting cultural differences and removing procedural obstacles that prevent marginalized groups from meaningfully participating in decisions that affect their property, well-being, and risk. Research has demonstrated that people care as much about how disputes are resolved as about the outcomes they achieve. So when planning processes are perceived to be unfair or unjust, the likelihood of maladaptive outcomes is significantly increased. So my talk today is grounded in the hypothesis that the best way to achieve procedural justice is through deep listening, which is a form of institutional and community intake that holds diversity and seeks to balance the familiar with the unfamiliar, holding tensions and frictions rather than resolving and creating inauthentic homogeneity for the sake of imposed health and well-being currencies. The deep listening framework that I'll discuss today emerged out of my research group at MIT focused on climate adaptation. We developed this framework to address the urgent governance needs of adaptation. And as it turns out, it is directly applicable to the future of cities more generally. Deep listening requires institutions to engage with communities while critically considering their own value and values. Achieving greater efficiency in the delivery of services and related communication strategies is in line with the traditional definition of value creation by government. However, this narrow consideration of value might reduce the capacity for organizations to incorporate the values of local communities that enable them to both flourish and persist. Because of barriers of trust in existing institutional structures and a mismatch of priorities between those of institutions and those of communities, it is clear that the sole technical capacity of institutions is not sufficient to govern. Resources need to be devoted to creating collaborative governance structures which prioritize local values through multi-sectoral decision-making arrangements and that have the ability to translate between community and institutional contexts. So Ansel and Gash define collaborative governance as an arrangement where the government directly engages with other stakeholders in a collective decision-making process. And and with a specific setting and rules that aims towards consensus, that's deliberate, and that aims to make or implement public policy or manage public programs or assets. So there is need for accessible, adaptable, and accountable communication tools that can make collaborative governance the norm rather than the exception. These tools should support institutional learning so that stories are not lost and insights can be connected to inputs. So in other words, there's need for deep listening. And so I'm going to describe the 5 components of deep listening and how we need to understand them in relationship to one another. So they include knowledge sharing, which is mutually agreed upon protocols for data production and use, holding space or the co-creating of spaces where institutional actors and communities can exchange, learn from each other, and discuss, the production and sharing of civic imaginaries where local knowledge and community values are respected, sense-making with a diversity of perspectives and scientific data. That's really the sticking point right there. And evaluation and monitoring support to assure accountability and to assess quality of information. So I want to talk about each of these a little bit and then provide some examples. So knowledge sharing. So for successful collaborative governance, stakeholders must rely on trustable primary data. However, data collected by institutions differs from the data potentially collected by communities. Smart governments see their role as the collector and processor of data concerning demand for public goods and services, so that allocation of resources can be rationalized, quantified, and addressed through efficiency-focused tools and processes. As Shannon Maedern argues, smart urbanism is an understanding of what we know about a city and of what is worth knowing about it, which systematically excludes other forms of local place-based intelligences and knowledge institutions. Likewise, as D'Ignacio and Klein argue, normative decisions behind what data is collected, how it is displayed, its accountability, and how it is made authoritative are crucial. In this sense, data feminism, a viewpoint that aims to achieve the most complete knowledge through the synthesizing of multiple perspectives, with priority given to local, indigenous, and experiential ways of knowing, presents a valuable viewpoint. So for institutions to collaborate with communities in data sharing, there's need for data sharing protocols. These are social and technical rules that establish equitable data governance. An example of this is the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance from the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group, which is a network of Indigenous peoples, scholars, nonprofit organizations, and governments. In the context of smart cities, this means ensuring that data and information about and from communities are controlled by communities. And while there are many existing sources for official government data, for example, government data portals, there are few equivalent trusted sources for community-generated data. So while developing such protocols is not technically challenging, the challenge is configuring it such that it addresses both community concerns like threats to privacy, security, and extractive use of data, as well as creates avenues for providing local observations that will be of value to institutional actors. So now I want to talk about holding space. So once data protocols are established, once the rules of social and technical sharing are established, there's need to pay specific attention to the design of the spaces of interaction. So while this can take many forms, I'm going to focus specifically on a kind of arrangement called an urban living lab. So really first introduced by William Mitchell at the Media Lab in the 1990s, ULLs, as they're referred, can be defined simply as a means of testing new technologies and strategies to cope with complex social problems. They're particularly popular in the European policy sphere with dozens of examples in specific policy areas such as housing, economic development, and energy. These spaces of experimentation can be powerful, but they can also reproduce existing power dynamics due to their common outcome orientation, typically focused on institutional needs. So in typical planning procedures, institutions consult with communities in a variety of formats, often through formal presentations and feedback sessions, interactive workshops, or digital input conversation tools such as WhatsApp. But designing these spaces, both physical and digital, such that they are inclusive and accommodating of generative discussion, it's not easy, and it tends to be an afterthought. So there needs to be clear intention to create space of democratic discussion. So holding space means creating environments of exchange that ensure the necessary conditions for dialogue and then make room for multiple perspectives and is tolerant of dissent. So it implies not only establishing a field of action through trusted links with the involved stakeholders, but also purposefully designing the conditions, so time, place, mediums, through which participants can engage freely. So being intentional about design for democratic exchange means creating spaces that mediate between different kinds of knowledge. What Indigenous scholar Eli Enns calls ethical space is an intermediary between two knowledge systems, a common space designed specifically for this collaborative encounter. So the role of institutions at these exchanges is to co-create, legitimize, and participate in these spaces. These interactions involve actively acknowledging institutional actors' power positions and generatively addressing these power imbalances in a way that necessarily seeks procedural justice. So civic imaginaries is the third component. Henry Jenkins defines civic imagination as the capacity to imagine alternatives to current cultural, social, political, or economic conditions. And he says one cannot change the world without imagining what a better world might look like. He argues that the civic imagination requires and is realized through the ability to imagine the process of change, to see oneself as a civic agent capable of making change, to feel solidarity with others whose perspective and experiences are different than one's own, to join a larger collective with shared interests, and to bring imaginative dimensions to real world spaces and places. These imaginaries are always informed by technology. Jasanoff defines socio-technical imaginaries as collectively held and performed visions of desirable futures. How one imagines a future is going to be informed by and generated with technologies. So actually, are you looking? There we go. So what we're looking at here is a mural that was part of a public exhibit in Boston that asked people to produce imaginaries through past, present, and future technologies. The goal was to spark stories of technological futures that were informed by technological pasts. And I'm going to talk more about this project in a bit. But the stories of desirable futures have long been told within communities, of course, reflecting community-based knowledges and narrative practices. But these efforts, typically emerging long before the start of official planning processes, are overwhelmingly disconnected from institutional procedures, providing barriers to much needed integration of local knowledge. So the challenge is to figure out how to operationalize these imaginaries into concrete future visions, enabling community stories to effectively reach and support institutional decision makers in ways that are discernible to them. So likewise, there is a need for institutions' model-based future projections to be translated into languages, stories that make sense to communities. So before I leave the civic imaginary component, there is, and I'll talk about some of the work that's going on in this space, there's incredible effort, and including my own work for the last decade, has been focused on kind of cultivating these imaginaries. But as we keep doing this work and get better at it, we run into the problem of translation, which is the fourth component that I want to talk about, which is sense making. How do we move those imaginaries effectively into institutional logics so that both institutions and the communities that they represent are able to make sense of them? So deep listening involves enhancing communities' capacity to listen to scientific data and enhancing institutions' capacity to listen to communities' imaginaries. Specific technologies like decision support tools and dashboards can be utilized to incorporate different visions. They can complement steps and validated processes for planning, such as risk and vulnerability analyses, and aim to inform discussions, show weak points, knowledge gaps, and uncertainties, and visualize trends. However, what data is collected, how it is contextualized, who gets to see it, are all decided upon by institutional actors. So sense is being made of vast amounts of data, but what data and whose sense? More promising technologies can be utilized for the dialogic function of reconciling multiple points of view sourced from aggregated imaginaries into nuanced suggestions and documented decisions. So while artificial intelligence is often seen as a means for rationalizing knowledge and depriving it of context, there is an opportunity to utilize it to develop and test mechanisms to pull insights from a range of stories, scientific reports, and news articles so that institutions and partnering communities can see the same data. So for example, the Real Talk for Change project developed by the Center for Constructive Technology at the MIT Media Lab proposes a methodology for community members to share stories, which are processed by a software that can retrieve the deeper texture and complexity of the views of the community through qualitative data captured in conversation. So these insights are useful for institutions to understand the values of the community engaging in planning in a language that institutions can act upon, taking part in effective institutional transformation that bypass communicative disconnects and produce effective collaborations between institutions and the communities central to transformation. This is not to dismiss the scholarship on the biases of artificial intelligence, especially towards gendered and racialized individuals. Co-creating these technologies between institutions and communities will require a collective effort of development, testing, and accountability through time, in line with what Gabe Mugar and I call persistent input. And I want to just draw attention to Real Talk for Change, in that this was recently launched in front of the mayoral election in Boston to gather input from a range of stakeholders across the city, with a primary focus on communities of color, and record those inputs not as merely text data, but as voice. And so as you navigate the site, you're able to hear actual people's voices speaking, and then search it in a way that's not only potentially meaningful to the communities that they represent, but also to institutions. So it's an exciting example of the kind of sense making that seems to be possible. And what we still need to talk about is how to institutionalize and integrate this into procedures, or systems like this into procedures more generally. So I want to go to the last component of deep listening, and then I'm going to provide a few more examples. So accountability is what we see as the fifth component. So deep listening requires ongoing evaluation and monitoring, well beyond the official timeline of a discrete process. So this involves the evaluation of information before, during, and after the formation of a plan, to assure that it is fact-based and adherent to cultural context. It also involves having mechanisms and tools to monitor the details of a plan to hold institutions accountable. So monitorial citizenship, as defined by Schützen, refers to a form of civic engagement in which people collect information about their surroundings or track issues of local or personal interest in order to improve their communities and pursue justice. So where common activities of the monitorial citizen include collecting information, sharing stories and insights, coordinating with networks of other civic actors, and pursuing accountability for institutions and elite individuals and their perceived responsibilities. Erhard Graef has done a really great job in kind of operationalizing some of these ideas of monitorial citizenship in his work in building tools in this space, which I'll talk about in a second. And so while these practices in general are frequently performed outside the scope of institutions, smart cities must incorporate tools for communities to evaluate and monitor in a way that shares factuality of claims between institutions and communities and holds institutions accountable for their actions. So in order for participants to be able to track elements of plans and appropriately hold institutions accountable for implementation, there is need to create tools that challenge power imbalances and allow communities to actively engage, manipulate, and understand scientific and policy data, and further engage with it in the context of collaborative work. The Promise Tracker is one such tool. It's an interesting example that was developed to track promises of politicians in Brazil. And it provided some promising results, in fact, but didn't move beyond the prototype phase, which is a significant problem with the current state of civic tech research in general. Evaluation and measurement, again, broadly speaking, of progress and change within communities, just has to be carried out through agreed upon standards and owned by communities in a way that holds them accountable for their commitments. So in that sense, collaborative governance must critically assess how institutions can be held accountable to communities for the details of plans, and likewise, how communities can be held accountable to institutions. Accountability systems must represent every stakeholder as having a role and responsibility in effective planning and policymaking, and we need to invest appropriately in the tools to make that happen. So I'm going to introduce a few case studies, one of which I've already teased, which is the Beta Blocks case study in Boston. And this is an action research and design project that was mostly done in 2018. So it was developed, Beta Blocks was developed with the mayor's office of New Urban Mechanics in Boston, and the architecture firm Supernormal. And it's really an exploration of components 2 and 3 of deep listening. The problem we were seeking to solve is how to incorporate community voice in decision-making about the selection and procurement of urban technologies, specifically as they are manifested in the public realm. And in the spirit of experimentation, we sought to design a system that would create friction in the norm of closed backroom dealings, where tech company X sits down with bureaucrat Y to solve for problems defined without consultation with communities. So how do we create some kind of mechanism where that decision-making process gets disrupted, specifically in this case about the procurement decisions about public realm technologies? So we designed 5 components of the Beta Blocks experiment. It included an exploration zone, which I'll describe in a second, each of which was governed by an advisory group of that zone, a traveling public exhibit, an explicit attention to youth involvement and the development of youth curriculum, and then some function for making recommendations to the city, a collaborative decision-making process. So we decided in the first experiment to work in 3 distinct neighborhoods in the city of Boston. Essentially these neighborhoods were decided for kind of geographic and socioeconomic diversity. And these exploration zones, where each of these zones was approximately 4 square blocks in size. What happened within each of the zones was the relaxed permitting for the temporary installation of public realm technologies. And each of the zones was informally governed by an advisory group. So we had the ability to place tech in place without the permitting process. And we had the ability, in the case of this experiment, to have those decisions entirely guided by the advisory group. So these zone advisory groups, as they were called, they were assembled as soon as the zone was created. They included a diversity of stakeholders, including community leaders, volunteers, and youth. They met monthly during the existence of the zone. Their goal was to match local priorities with tech, so to understand what the needs were, and then what tech essentially was being put on the table by the city. So all those backroom dealings that I was talking about before was bringing those to the surface and trying to match some of the utility of each of those technologies with the actual needs coming from the neighborhood. And then identify locations and provide feedback for those installed tech and data policies, including a transparency around business plan. So one of these technologies was a startup, a local Cambridge startup called SUFA. And these are solar powered interactive billboard signs, and they were placed in the various zones. This is an example that was sort of easy to understand, and the utility made a ton of sense to people. And there were specific demands that came from distinct neighborhoods, such as what kinds of advertisements were on the billboard. So, for example, in Chinatown, there was a very loud voice or collection of voices that were against any kind of gambling ads because of its impact on that community. And so example, there was the way in which what the prohibitions about what ads could be there, and then also there was all sorts of concerns and conversations and desires to see how the data was being used, and to have access for the data. So who was passing by the sign, all that data existed because there were sensors in the sign, and then how that was being, how that could be used by the community to make their own decisions. So all of that was kind of incorporated by the advisory group itself. Another example is an air quality sensor that was put up in various neighborhoods. This was something that came out of Microsoft research, and there was lots of desire for these air quality sensors around the community. So they were hung up. There were these signs that were placed everywhere they were that described what it is that was there in the place, and then provided a phone number and other kinds of other ways of kind of getting in touch with the city to provide any kind of feedback or comment about these sites. So again, the locations of these and then how the data was used was governed by the advisory group. I won't go into this, but I will say that the important part is that, or another important part of this is that there was this traveling exhibit. So this exhibit that moved around the city, that was organized around this 9x18 inflatable structure that brought people together to talk about the role of new technology in their neighborhoods. Again, desires, needs, anxieties. So this moved around the city. There was programming that sort of was organized around this blob. And then conversations and input were sort of gathered within this space, and then all of that was fed into the advisory group. Again, it sort of moved about the city in all sorts of interesting ways. Now, the project concluded with an exhibit at City Hall so that government officials could take notice of a novel mechanism for decision making. At the end of the day, we learned that we could build structures to intervene in existing models of procurement. We could create ways of showcasing scientific and community data in a way that made for more informed decisions with transparent procedure. What we couldn't accomplish in the 1 year of funding we received from the Knight Foundation to do this was actually institutionalizing the new mechanism with the necessary stakeholders in government. So we have a model that informs 3 components of deep listening. It held space for diverse stakeholders, it supported imaginaries, and it provided structures for making sense of them. But now we just need to invest in sustainability, and this becomes a significant problem with all of this work. And part of the reason why I am so strongly advocating for the connectivity of these 5 components as a model of how we think about smart cities, because if we actually did understand these 5 components as related, the sustainability conversation, which would have been a lot easier at the time. All right, I'm going to provide one more example, and then I'm going to conclude, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So this other case study is some work that we've conducted in Cluj-Napoca, Romania. So this was organized around a ULL that has been dubbed Our Cluj. And it's an example of government wanting to center imagination in how it does business. So in my interview with the mayor, Emil Bach, he said this to me. He says, "I'm inviting you to a competition in our city. The competition will be called the Competition of Dreams. So your dream is going to be part of our competition. You never know. You may win, but you'll never lose. You can be sure of that." So perhaps spoken like a good politician, but he has embraced the discourse of imagination, dreams, collaboration, progress. And under his leadership, Cluj has become one of the fastest growing cities in Romania and in Eastern Europe. And it was named the Youth Capital of Europe by the European Commission in 2015. It's got a population of about 325,000 people and over 420,000 in the metro area. Politicians have projected an optimistic growth narrative, generally, about Cluj and the metro area. According to the mayor, Cluj is a place for winning but never losing. It's a place for risk-taking and innovation because it is impossible to fail. And Mayor Bach is generally perceived of as a reformer. So he was elected to his first term in 2004. He then became the prime minister of Romania and then came back to be the mayor of CLuj. And he has been eager to oversee this fast economic growth and continued democratic governance in a place that's stagnated under communism and post-communist regimes. Mayor Bach can be described as both a seasoned politician and a storyteller. His political philosophy is defined by a belief that stories of the future need to be told by the government and citizens. Through these stories, it is possible to imagine and then realize new beginnings. So over the last year, my team and I conducted 57 interviews with stakeholders in CLuj, from government, the private sector, and community. And we documented the creation of our CLuj, which is this multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary living lab that seeks to shift this normative value structure by centering the values of trust and care in project work. And we've dubbed this arrangement a values-based ULL. So prioritizing values for these actors is a requirement for creating policies and programs that are optimized for outcomes such as enhanced well-being. So efficient technological futures and democratic futures are not necessarily divergent. However, what we see in CLuj is that they are in direct tension. As stakeholders in the city seek to build a viable innovation frame for a desirable future CLuj, they are actively confronting the implications of imagining a future without first reconciling the past. The communist past is rather present in people's everyday experience with the public sector. As one person we spoke to said, "I know it sounds bad, but we need for the people, we need for the people that were mature before the revolution to be physically dead, not just retired, but physically dead because they will not let go of power." This bleak assessment of the future colored by the past was widely shared. So as the city strives to become smart, to compete on a world stage as the Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe, there is a widely held belief that a focus on values of trust and even care must inform any stable vision of the future. So the way that we did this work is that a visual artist sat in on each of our interviews to capture the affective qualities of what was being said. Each interviewee was then asked to do a follow-up where they reflected on the representation and asked questions about how it represented their imagined future. This unearthed some fascinating details about the underlying value structure informing their innovation work, including fears and anxieties. I learned from CLuj that listening requires more than just supporting visions of the future. In fact, future visions are always in relation to the past. This is profoundly visible in CLuj, but it is present everywhere and should be considered an important characteristic of civic imaginaries. In our soon-to-be published report on CLuj, we report on imagining futures actually in 3 parts: imagining possible urban futures, reflecting on history and past harms, and exploring novel practices that promote power sharing. This tripartite structure represents a constructionist approach to imagination. Say what one wants, reflect on what informs that vision, and then learn through putting into practice. So in conclusion, for a city to be smart, policymakers must understand the value of investing in equitable communication infrastructure that is able to engage with communities and allow for democratic exchanges. I have called this infrastructure deep listening, and I've outlined 5 components that should be investigated and developed to mitigate maladaptive smart city outcomes in the near future. We need to understand and develop new tools for knowledge sharing, which includes the explicit articulation of data sharing protocols. We must reimagine how institutions are holding space for communities and create mechanisms and design specifications so that these inclusive physical and digital spaces can be replicable. We must support local imaginaries by co-creating the tools and platforms that support stories of possible futures, accounting for past and present practices. And we must ensure that institutions can make sense of a range of inputs gathered from communities, including quantitative and qualitative data. And we must incorporate AI tools carefully to build trust between actors. And finally, we need to build systems of accountability where stakeholders have the ability to archive promises and apply pressure to ensure follow through. So while each of these components opens a range of research inquiries, the power of the deep listening agenda is to see them as necessarily connected. We need to embrace the complexity of communication infrastructure and seek to understand how research can be applied to transform systems. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for that. That was great. It was really, really interesting. And I'm very excited for the conversation and the dialogue to come from here. So with that, would anyone like to kick us off for our Q&A? It's like we have a question here in the chat from Christopher McConnell. It says, I work in local government and have a PhD in media studies. My city department was recently involved in a research project along these lines with the local university, and it did not go well in large part to different cultures and incentives between the academy and local government. What suggestions could you provide for fostering productive collaborations and community engagement and co-creation?
What a good question, and so nice to see that a fellow media studies PhD is working in government. Great combination. But you know, well, I didn't actually talk much about universities as institutions specifically in need of developing these mechanisms, and that was, but they are, right? I mean, universities operate in a remarkably hierarchical institutional logic, and you know, they have done a lot of harm in the communities that they exist within. You know, NYU is an urban university, and I don't know the ins and outs of the reputation of NYU within the surrounding communities, but I imagine it's not great everywhere. And like it is in again with most institutions. Now the challenge is similar. The challenge is the logics of universities dominate. You know, the money flows through them. The hierarchies are present. The transactional nature of research is always going to guide the structure of interaction. Changing that, creating a situation where where the engagement does not work on university timelines, for example, where we don't work with in semester increments or grant cycles that are too short, where accountability of the university partner goes beyond a particular research contract or grants or course. All of these things are, sorry, my daughter is calling me. All of these things are necessary to consider before these projects take place. And I think the challenge is, like, how do we think beyond the traditional research partnership when we imagine how universities can effectively collaborate with communities. And this gets even more complicated when when we sort of get into the ULL context, where we have multiple sectors, right? When we have university, we have government, we have community, we have the private sector. How do we assure that those dominant logics of those institutions don't dominate? Because it's always going to be the community partner that suffers in this regard, unless all of the things around setting the conditions for deep listening are in place, unless we establish those protocols early on, unless we actually take the time to hold space, to design for actually holding space. That stuff doesn't happen within the traditional research framework. So I have so much more to say about that, and I'm gonna stop and maybe we can get more into some other details. So thanks for the question. I see Graham has his hand up.
Yeah, go for it, Graham.
Yeah, hi, thank you, fantastic. Really, really nice talk and really good examples. I guess my question is about accountability and associated with it power, because it feels like that final step is typically where good intentions butt up against strong existing practices. You know, you see it from participatory design through community-based science, through digital civics, all kinds of areas have a lot of the same participatory processes up into accountability. So I'm kind of super interested in that last point of what your thoughts are about changing that power dynamic and enabling accountability.
Yeah, I mean, I think accountability it is the stickiest problem, I think, right? Because it requires a ceding of power to an extent by the institutions who have it. That's going to require changes in leadership, which I mentioned. You know, New York has a new mayor, and there's all sorts of opportunities there for some changes in New York City. Boston has a new mayor and new administration, new city council, and in some ways, when we have new leadership that has run on some of these principles of accountability, right? That we have an opportunity to actually instantiate them within mechanisms. And this is why I'm a little bit excited for a moment that we're in right now. Something that I don't actually see institutionalized anywhere else that we can speak. I mean, I suppose Barcelona maybe has done some really great work in this area, but outside of a few contexts, it's really hard to point to things that seem usable in other places. But I think in the U.S. context, I think there is a really interesting opportunity now to begin to explore actually designing these mechanisms. And this is why I want to be really cognizant of latching on to the discourse that is of this moment right now. And I can speak specifically to the United States. This discourse that is of this moment, and then be able to think about what kinds of mechanisms and tools can we build to sustain that moment, right? To sustain that discourse. And so I think it is important for us to start thinking about tools and technologies in this way. I use one example of Promise Tracker, which again, I really like that project a lot. And but like I said, it kind of fell into the trap of many of these projects, which is that it happened, it was cool, there was a paper or two written about it, and then it goes away, and it becomes a footnote. And so, and the challenge is that institutions and government in particular is able to kind of silo off its ceding of power. So take participatory budgeting as an example, right? Like that's an example where we can like silo off a little bit and say, okay, you can have the power. And then we can pat ourselves on the back for doing it, but then the structures remain exactly the same. So now we need to actually be thinking about how do we know how to do it in silos. So now we need to be thinking about like, how can we expand that and institutionalize that a little bit more. So I'm really intrigued by what's possible in that space, although I don't have really great examples beyond what I've shared today. So yeah, thanks, Graham.
Great. It looks like Eric, you want to go ahead and go?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Am I on? Oh, great. Hey, Eric, long time no see.
Hey, Eric, great to see you.
First of all, I have to plug Eric's book, Meaningful Inefficiencies. Should be required reading for anyone at CUSP, my CUSP colleagues. Please read this book. If you want to borrow it, I'm going to leave it on my desk. You have to read this. It's super relevant. So Eric's being too humble. I'll say, okay, so after the plug, I want to go into one, I think, really interesting element about everything that you sort of talked about in some of your examples, especially beta blocks. There's this really interesting spatial element to everything, right? Which are really with the way that these sort of contact points are being created with the signs and the mobile van. It's something that I talk about in my work a lot, this concept of meeting people where they are, where you are closing these different distances that exist between the city and places of power with people. So you could think about it in terms of distance. There's social distance, spatial distance and knowledge, all of these different psychological distances, and that entire theory actually comes out of NYU too. But what I want to sort of get you to talk about a little bit more is this tension between the digital and the spatial, because so much of these communication infrastructures attempt to obviate the spatial aspects of these interactions. And there's an assumption that as we move forward, as we advance smart cities, as we have more of these technologies, that those kinds of contact points and the need to be in space, especially we're on Zoom now, right, is going to be obviated. And why do we need to have a sign or be in a room? So can you I guess it's not necessarily a question, but can you elaborate on that tension between this distance and the need, the tension between the digital and the physical?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I'm trying to figure out how best to respond. It's hard to make the distinction, right? Because we know that data collection is happening in physical and digital spaces. Let's say there's data surveillance in both of these spaces, and one of the things that we learned in the beta blocks process is that people were very aware of data surveillance in digital spaces, but not actually aware of data surveillance in physical spaces, and sort of didn't understand the possibility of that, both the harm and the possibility of that. And so I think the challenge here is that in some ways we need to stop thinking about these as a binary, right? I mean, this gets to like we're not going to live in Zuckerberg's metaverse, but it's just going to be our world, right? And so I in that sense, I think these principles apply across whether we're talking about digital or physical spaces. And yes, there are where people are and the challenges that people are facing on a daily basis feel more present in the physical world. But I do think that we will benefit when we think about these digital transitions or these smart city transitions. We will benefit to hold within the same breath what kinds of just systems we want to create in both physical and digital spaces. I mean, I'll give you an example of when in the Beta Blocks project I was talking to a woman who came to the exhibit at one point, and she. At first she's like, I don't care about technology. My grandson thinks about that. I don't care about that. And we started talking a little bit more. And then she said, she was talking about taking her commute, getting on the bus and how crowded it was. And she was explaining that sometimes they just like the bus driver is so crowded, the bus driver just waves her on. And so she doesn't get a chance to tap her card, just waves her on. And as we kept talking, she's like, oh yeah, I'm not being counted, right? So I get waved on, I'm not being counted. So when the city looks at that data, they're not actually seeing exactly how busy that bus is. And they're not actually increasing bus service in my community because it's too busy, right? So, and the bus driver just waves us on. And so then at that point, she's like, oh, you know what, there is that sensing technologies do matter to me and data collection does matter to me. And I think that's the kind of overlap that I want. I just think we as academics and as urban practitioners of various sorts need to get better at. We need to get better at sort of drawing that line and sort of imagining just worlds that are both digital and physical. That might be a cop out to your deep question, Eric, but I really want to.
It's fine. It's showing the overlaps.
Yeah,
it's showing the overlaps, but that's exactly, I would argue that, that kind of insight and that kind of rich, that sort of rich, complex insight that you're able to gather, I think, is only possible through the closure of social and spatial distance, right? The fact that you were spatially close and you're able to get her to open up in this way is a product of the closure of these two distances. So that's exactly. It sort of proves my point, but I'm certainly on one side of this binary in a way that is probably not productive, and you know that.
Actually, let me give you one more quick example, Eric, if you don't mind. The one more quick example is a project that came out of some work that we've been doing here in Boston called the Boston Collaborative Governance Network. One of the groups in this project that was led by a community leader, this was, in the height of COVID, sort of developed a PDF guide for how to get online, how to use Zoom and other kind of video platforms so that they can continue to participate in civic life. So people who were active in their communities were now being put online, and then some of them were disconnected from the mechanisms to just basic engagement. And so she produced this thing as part of this network. It then got some support through other grants, and now it's been reproduced in, I think, 4 languages at this point and circulated across the city. And it's a simple guide that tries to just bridge that gap between digital and physical spaces, and how, and it seems so simple, but bridging that gap requires attention and requires design. And I think it's a really beautiful example that sort of emerged from some of this work.
So we have 2 minutes here. We have a few more questions left. Eric, I don't know if you have time to stick around for a little while longer. If not, that's fine, but we'll see what we can get done. Asnat, do you want to go?
Sure, thank you. Yes, thanks so much for this talk, really great. I was curious about what you brought up about ethical spaces where community collected data or information is met with government collected data and trying to discuss and share these ideas. I was just curious if you have any examples of how these communities can be more successful in those engagements. The example you shared in Romania was really great, and that was a government-led opportunity where they were listening and trying to engage in deep listening. I'm curious if you have just any examples where the community was really thinking ahead of how to be most interoperable with getting their information and ideas actually heard and listened to.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because the responsibility often. So what happens is that the terms of engagement are often set by government or academics, right? So we set the terms of engagement. We say, okay, we want to hear you. We want to hear from you, and so we're going to create a platform and we're going to get your feedback. Now, it's far more interesting, I think, when there's an opportunity for the community conversations that are already taking place, and often long-standing community conversations, to invite government into that conversation on their terms, on community terms. And that doesn't happen that much, often because government doesn't know how to pay attention to things that it didn't create, right? So, and some of that is because of laws on the books, and some of that is because of just institutional norms and procedures. But the very basic premise here is that how can the community conversations with the norms and the logics that are guiding those community conversations, how can those be the spaces that institutions are invited into on communities' terms, right? So it's one thing when government does it, it's quite another thing when we can reverse the table. And the best example I can point to is one that I shared, which I'm really excited about, which is the Real Talk for Change example. And this is and you should please check it out if you just Google it and check it out. It's from the Learning Voices Network is the kind of organization that, or Cortico is the name of the organization that is operating this technology, but they've done some really extraordinary work with amplifying and highlighting community voices, and then allowing those community voices, again, on their own terms, to have influence and power with government decision makers. So it's one example that I'm really excited about, and one that I think that as we get kind of more institutional buy-in to these sorts of tools, that we can see more of this work taking place. Now, I think that's a design challenge, right? Like, again, how do we actually institutionalize this work so that government decision makers can say, like, oh, okay, I see this, and I'm going to look at it. I'm going to see the same thing as my community collaborators. I'm going to make decisions, and then I'm going to allow those decisions to be traceable to the data that inform those decisions, right? That's still yet to be determined. But I think the technology that we see with Real Talk for Change is getting us pretty close to imagining what might be possible.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
By chance,
Thank you.
do you have time for one more question?
I do, yeah, I can stick around for a few minutes.
Jackie?
Hi, okay, great. I was curious about the, like, I always like to work off of examples. So that's always where I start, but I was really curious about the example you gave for the promise tracker. I liked that example. And speaking also to this idea of distance. And so I guess maybe the distance here is between government and citizens. I'm not sure if there's a technical name for that distance, but I'd definitely be interested in talking more to people at NYU about this theory. But in that sense, so with a promise tracker, it gets made as a footnote because the project ends. So what is an example of how that could not happen? So what has to happen to make the promise tracker part of policy, right? I mean, maybe there's multiple ways to do that, but what are some paths that you see to making that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that question of like, how do we actually institutionalize power sharing? And this is something that is, this is something that is challenging because there's no the incentives don't line up, right? The incentives don't line up to do this. And so how can we imagine systems where the incentives do line up? And this is why I think that, this is only going to happen through collaborative governance structures, right? So, right now we have, when decision-making protocols are positioned and well-established within singular institutions, then accountability isn't there. The incentives for accountability are limited. But when decision-making protocols are situated within collaborative mechanisms, so like, even what I've spoke about in CLuj is an interesting example of a multi-sectoral group of people, including government, where government comes to the table, but they don't set it. And they haven't quite gotten to the point of making policy decisions within that arrangement, but I think that's possible, right? I think it's possible to identify where certain decisions get made. So like, we look at budget, for example, like where budget decisions get made and by whom, and what are the mechanisms in which outside sectors, including community, nonprofit, even academia, can be brought in to those decisions in a way where the accountability for those decisions is clear. So and so I think that's really the sticking point. Like, how do we create a system where people within institutions feel safe in some ways, right? Feel safe to be held accountable for the decisions that they make. So this is not just a one-way street. Like, we also have to create institutional mechanisms that seem reasonable to the people operating within those institutions who may very well be very well intentioned, right? So how do we create those systems where accountability is not a threat to person or livelihood, and that we can and I suspect, and again, this is my hypothesis, that happens through these collaborative structures. And if we don't have those collaborative structures, then there's really no possibility. Then it becomes about pressure campaigns, and that's the end of it, right? And we have to get beyond that sort of pressure campaign model. Bruce just directly messaged me saying, sounds like whistleblowing. Yeah, it sounds like whistleblowing, which we need to avoid, right? Like, this is where, like, we have to get beyond kind of accountability, like the whistleblowing model of accountability, and the whistleblower, or the applying pressure model of movement politics, right? Like, how can we actually sort of imagine these mechanisms within government and within policymaking? So, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
I think that what you just said at the end about making people feel safe is so key. And I think that just makes me think how it might be really that coming from that, looking at, you mentioned feminism at one point, and just different types of more institutionalized diversity schemes, because in those cases, you also have the exact same issues. So maybe we can be pulling from those disciplines to understand how to create safe structures for people to be holding, yeah, I'm not,
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in this area, so I'm not so eloquent, but yeah, this is great. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. And I also I did hint in the talk that accountability needs to be mutual, right? Like we actually need to think about what it looks like for communities to be accountable to institutions. And the power is different, but we still need to think about accountability. And so it does get into that, to that idea of like, we need to create the conditions where accountability is possible and not a threat. So yeah.
Thank you.
So this has been great, and I think it's evidenced by the fact that I think we could probably do the Q&A for another hour if we went around. So I'm going to go ahead and call it here, and I want to thank you again so much for a really engaging talk, and you've left us all with quite a bit to think about. So yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And thank you all for attending, and we'll see you all next time. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.